The gunshot cracked the still air like a thunderbolt. It was January 20th, 1973, just past 9 p.m. in Conakry, Guinea. The men who pulled the trigger weren't strangers. They had once fought beside him, broken bread with him, praised his name. But now they stood over his bleeding body, unmoved. One of them looked down, raised his pistol again, and fired into his head. Just like that, Amílcar Cabral, the poet of revolution, the strategist of dignity, the agronomist of war, was gone. But the revolution he built? It had just entered a new chapter. Amílcar Cabral was born on September 12, 1924, in Bafata, a small town in Portuguese Guinea, what we now call Guinea-Bissau. His family came from Cape Verde, and he grew up straddling two identities. But perhaps that was his first lesson, that identity could be fluid, layered, and used to unite rather than divide. From the beginning, Cabral showed signs of brilliance. He wasn't loud or boastful. He was a quiet observer, a lover of books, and a questioner of everything. His father, a school teacher turned postal worker, emphasized education as the path to dignity. Amílcar listened. When he won a scholarship to study agronomy in Lisbon, he entered a world very different from Bafata. Portugal was still under the dictatorship of Antonio Salazar, and racism simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. But Lisbon was also where many future African leaders were gathering. Among them were Agostinho Neto of Angola and Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique. They didn't just meet, they debated, wrote manifestos, shared dreams. It was in those small, smoky student apartments that the idea of liberation movements began to take form. Cabral stood out, not for being the loudest, but for being the sharpest. He could dissect colonialism like a scientist. He could speak about Marxism one moment and African oral poetry the next. He believed that revolution without culture was a dead revolution. When he returned to Africa in the early 1950s, he didn't pick up a gun. He picked up a notebook. As an agronomist working for the Portuguese, he traveled deep into the countryside, measuring rainfall, testing soil, mapping plantations. But what he really learned was how people lived, how colonialism wasn't just about borders or flags, but about daily humiliation, hunger, and erasure. He began organizing quietly, first through cultural groups, then politically. In 1956, together with his half-brother Luis Cabral, he founded the Portuguese, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. At first, the movement sought peaceful change. They demanded reforms, respect, rights. Lisbon responded with brutality. By the early 1960s, the door to negotiation was slammed shut. The Guinea-Bissau War of Independence began in 1963. While other African liberation movements focused on dramatic assaults or aligning with Cold War superpowers, Cabral's war was methodical, precise, surgical. He trained villagers in sabotage, not just rifle use. He taught guerrillas to read and write. He established liberated zones where, even during wartime, children went to school and farmers received land reforms. Imagine that. A revolution that built clinics in the middle of war. Cabral believed that the people were not just foot soldiers, they were the revolution itself. He once said, "The people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward." This was a man who knew that revolutions were not just against something, but for something. Meanwhile, Lisbon poured soldiers, weapons, and money into Guinea-Bissau, but they were fighting a war they didn't understand. The Portuguese army, made up of conscripts who didn't even speak the local languages, found themselves isolated in the jungle. Mines exploded beneath their trucks. Ambushes happened in silence, and most painfully, they couldn't tell friend from foe because most villagers supported the PAIGC. Cabral wasn't just outmaneuvering them on the battlefield. He was beating them politically and morally. Even the international community began to notice. Cuba sent doctors and instructors. The Soviet Union and China provided weapons. Sweden, a neutral European country, became one of the first to send aid to the PAIGC. In 1972, the movement declared independence in the areas it controlled. Cabral was traveling across Africa and Europe, winning hearts, minds, and diplomatic recognition. He was no longer just a rebel, he was a statesman in waiting. And Lisbon was growing desperate. They couldn't win on the battlefield, so they turned to subversion. Using their notorious secret police, PIDE, Portugal sought to break the movement from the inside. They exploited ethnic tensions, old rivalries, personal grudges. They found weaknesses and they found traitors. One of them was Inocencio Cani, a PAIGC member who had grown resentful, perhaps jealous, perhaps manipulated. On the night of January 20th, 1973, Cani and a group of disaffected fighters lured Cabral outside his house in Conakry. He had no reason to suspect anything. These were his comrades. Then they shot him, point blank. His wife Ana Maria screamed as she ran to his body, but it was too late. The man who had fought so that no African child would ever kneel before a foreign flag again lay dying in his homeland, betrayed not by an enemy, but by his own. And yet, they killed the man, but not the movement. Just 8 months later, the PAIGC formally declared independence. Over 60. Then, in 1974, the unthinkable happened. A revolution inside Portugal itself overthrew the Salazar regime. The new leaders, tired of colonial wars, recognized Guinea-Bissau's independence. The flag that Amílcar Cabral had designed, red for the struggle, green for the land, black for the people, was raised. The anthem he had helped write was sung. He never saw it, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Amílcar Cabral was more than a revolutionary. He was a builder of nations, a teacher of freedom, and a man who never believed in shortcuts. His most famous words weren't about war or death. They were about truth. Tell no lies. Expose lies wherever they are told. Mask no difficulties, mistakes, failures. Claim no easy victories. In a century full of charismatic leaders and violent uprisings, Cabral's revolution stood apart, not for how it began, but for what it promised: dignity, justice, and a future worth dying for.